An excerpt from the novel The Hot Zone by Richard Preston, Part 1, Spacewalk, 1400 hours, Wednesday. They arrived at the Institute in mid-afternoon. C.J. Peters parked beside a loading dock on the side of the building and found some soldiers to help him carry the garbage bags to a supply airlock that led to the Ebola suite. Nancy went to the office of a member of her staff, a lieutenant colonel named Ron Trotter, and told him to suit up and go in. She would follow. They would be buddies in the hot zone. As she always did before going into level 4, she took off her engagement ring and her wedding band and locked them away in her desk. She and Trotter walked down the hall together, and he went first into the small locker room that led to AA5 while she waited in the corridor. A light went on, telling her that he had gone on to the next level, and she swiped her security card across a sensor, which opened the door into the locker room. She took off all her clothes, put on a long-sleeved scrub suit, and stood before the door that led inward, blue light falling across her face. Beside the door, there was another security sensor. This one was a numerical keypad. You couldn't bring your security card with you into the higher levels. A security card would be melted or ruined by chemicals during the decontamination process. Therefore, you memorized your security code. She punched a string of numbers on the keypad, and the building's central computer noticed that Jax Nancy was attempting entry. Finding that she was cleared to enter AA5, the computer unlocked the door and beeped to let her know that she could proceed inward without setting off alarms. She walked through the shower stall into the bathroom, putting on white socks, and continued inward, opening a door that led to the Level 3 staging area. There, she met Lieutenant Colonel Trotter, a stocky, dark-haired man who Nancy had worked with for many years. They put on their inner gloves and taped their cuffs. Nancy put a pair of hearing protectors over her ears. She'd started wearing them a while back when people had begun to suspect that the roar of air in your suit might be loud enough to damage your hearing. They hauled on their spacesuits and sealed the Ziploc zippers. They edged around each other and fiddled with their suits. People wearing biohazard spacesuits tend to step around one another like two wrestlers at the beginning of a match, watching the other person's every move, especially watching the hands to make sure they don't hold a sharp object. This cringing becomes instinctive. They closed up their suits and lumbered across the staging area to a large airlock door. This was a supply airlock. It did not lead into the hot zone. It led to the outside world. They opened it. On the floor of the airlock sat the 7 garbage bags. "Take as many as you can carry," she said to Lieutenant Colonel Trotter. He picked up a few bags, and so did she. They shuffled across the staging area to the airlock that led to level 4. She picked up a metal pan containing tools. She was getting warm and her faceplate fogged up. They opened the airlock and stepped in together. Nancy took a breath and gathered her thoughts. She imagined that passing through the gray zone into level 4 was like a spacewalk, except that instead of going into outer space, you went into inner space, which was full of the pressure of life trying to get inside your suit. People went into level 4 areas all the time in the Institute, particularly the civilian animal caretakers. But going into a containment zone to perform a necropsy on an animal that had died of an amplified unknown hot agent was something a little different. This was high-hazard work. Nancy centered herself and brought her breathing under control. She opened the far door and went through to the hot side. Then she reached back inside the airlock and pulled on the chain in the chemical shower. That started a decontamination cycle running in the airlock that would eliminate any hot agents that might have leaked into the airlock as they were going through. They put on their boots and headed down the cinder block hallway, lugging the monkeys. Their air was going stale inside their spacesuits, and they needed to plug in right away. They came to a refrigerator room and put all the bags in the refrigerator except one. This bag they carried into the necropsy room. Stepping around each other cautiously, they plugged in their air hoses, and dry air cleared their faceplates. The air thundered distantly beyond Nancy's hearing protectors. They gloved up, pulling surgical gloves over their spacesuit gloves. She laid her tools in specimen containers at the head of the table, counting them off one by one. Trotter untwisted some ties on the garbage bag and opened it, and the hot zone inside the bag merged with the hot zone of the room. He and Nancy lifted the monkey out and laid it on the dissection table. She switched on a surgical lamp. Unclouded brown eyes stared at her. The eyes looked normal. They weren't red. The whites were white and the pupils were clear and black, dark as night. She could see a reflection of the lamp in the pupils. Inside the eyes, behind the eyes, there was nothing. No mind, no existence. The cells had stopped working. Once the cells in a biological machine stop working, it can never be started again. It goes into a cascade of decay, falling toward disorder and randomness. Except in the case of viruses, they can turn off and go dead. Then, if they come into contact with a living system, they can switch on and multiply. The only thing that lived inside this monkey was the unknown agent, and it was dead for the time being. It was not multiplying or doing anything, since the monkey's cells were dead. But if the agent touched living cells, Nancy's cells, it would come alive and begin to amplify itself. In theory, it could amplify itself around the world in the human species. She took up a scalpel and slit the monkey's abdomen, making a slow and gentle cut, keeping the blade well away from her gloved fingers. The spleen was puffed up and tough, leathery, like a globe of smoked salami. She couldn't see any bloody lesions inside this monkey. She'd expected that the monkey's interior would be a lake of blood, but no. This monkey looked all right. It had not bled into itself. If the animal had died of Ebola, this was not a clear case. She opened up the intestine. There was no blood inside it. The gut looked okay, and then she examined the stomach. There she found a ring of bleeding spots at the junction between the stomach and the small intestine. This could be a sign of Ebola, but it was not a clear sign. It could also be a sign of simian fever, not Ebola. Therefore, she could not confirm the presence of Ebola virus in this animal based on a visual inspection of the internal organs during necropsy. Using a pair of blunt scissors, she clipped wedges out of the liver and pressed them onto glass slides. Slides and blood tubes were the only glass objects allowed in the hot zone because of the danger of glass splinters if something broke. All lab beakers in the room were made of plastic. She worked slowly, keeping her hands out of the body cavity, away from the blood as much as possible, rinsing her gloves again and again in a pan of EnviroChem. She changed her gloves frequently. Trotter glanced at her every once in a while. He held the body open for her and clamped blood vessels, handing her tools when she asked for them. They could read each other's lips. "Forceps," she mouthed silently, pointing to it. He nodded and handed her a forceps. They did not talk. She was alone with the sound of her air. She was beginning to think that this monkey did not have Ebola virus. In biology, nothing is clear. Everything is too complicated. Everything is a mess. And just when you think you understand something, you peel off a layer and find deeper complications beneath. Nature is anything but simple. This emerging virus was like a bat crossing the sky at evening. Just when you thought you saw it flicker through your field of view, it was gone. Part 2, Insertion. December 1st, Friday. The alarm went off at 4:30. Jerry Jocks got up, shaved, brushed his teeth, threw on clothes, and was out of there. The teams were going to wear civilian clothes. No one wanted to attract attention. Soldiers in uniforms and camo, putting on spacesuits, it could set off a panic. It was 5 o'clock by the time he arrived at the Institute. There was no sign of dawn in the sky. A crowd of people had already gathered by a loading dock on the side of the building, under floodlights. There had been a hard freeze during the night, and their breath steamed in the air. Gene Johnson, the Ajax of this biological war, paced back and forth across the loading dock among a pile of camo military trucks, his stockpile of gear from Kittim Cave. The trucks contained field spacesuits, battery packs, rubber gloves, surgical scrub suits, syringes, needles, drugs, dissection tools, flashlights, 1 or 2 human surgery packs, blunt scissors, sample bags, plastic bottles, pickling preservatives, biohazard bags marked with red flowers, and hand-pumped garden sprayers for spraying bleach on spacesuits and objects that needed to be decontaminated. Holding a cup of coffee in his fist, Gene grinned at the soldiers and rumbled, "Don't touch my trunks." A white, unmarked supply van showed up. Gene loaded his trunks into the van by himself and set off for Reston. He was the first wave. By now, copies of the Washington Post were hitting driveways all over the region. It contained a front-page story about the monkey house. Deadly Ebola virus found in Virginia. Laboratory monkey. One of the deadliest known human viruses has turned up for the first time in the United States in a shipment of monkeys imported from the Philippines by a research laboratory in Reston. A task force of top state-level and federal experts on contagious diseases spent most of yesterday devising a detailed program to trace the path of the rare Ebola virus and who might have been exposed to it. That includes interviews with 4 or 5 lab workers who cared for the animals, which have since been destroyed as a precaution, and any other people who were near the monkeys. Federal and state health officials played down the possibility that any people had contracted the virus, which has a 50 to 90% mortality rate and can be highly contagious to those coming into direct contact with its victims. There is no known vaccine. There's always a level of concern, but I don't think anybody's panicked, said Colonel C.J. Peters, a physician and expert on the virus. CJ knew that if people learned what this virus could do, there would be traffic jams heading out of Reston, with mothers screaming at the TV cameras, "Where are my children?" When he talked to the Washington Post reporters, he was careful not to discuss the more dramatic aspects of the operation. "I thought it would be not a good idea to talk about the spacesuits," he explained to me much later. He was careful not to use scary military terms such as virus amplification, lethal chain of transmission, crash and bleed, or major pucker factor. Military biohazard operation was about to go down in a suburb of Washington, and he sure as hell didn't want the Post to find out about it. Half his biocontainment operation was going to be in news containment. C.J. Peters' comments to the Washington Post were designed to create an impression that the situation was under control, safe, and not all that interesting. CJ was understating the gravity of the situation, but he could be very smooth when he wanted, and he used his friendliest voice with the reporters, assuring them over the telephone that there was really no problem, just kind of a routine technical situation. Somehow the reporters concluded that the sick monkeys had been destroyed as a precaution, when in fact the nightmare and the reason for troops was that the animals hadn't been destroyed. As to whether the operation was safe, the only way to know was to try it. Peters felt that the larger danger could come from sitting back and watching the virus burn through the monkeys. There were 500 monkeys inside that building. That was about 3 tons of monkey meat, a biological nuclear reactor having a core meltdown. As the core of monkeys burned, the agent would amplify itself tremendously. CJ arrived at the loading dock at the Institute at 5 o'clock in the morning. He would accompany the group down to the monkey house to see Jerry's team inserted, and then he would drive back to the Institute to deal with the news, media, and government agencies. At 6:30, he gave an order to move out, and the column of vehicles left Fort Detrick's main gate and headed south toward the Potomac River. It consisted of a line of ordinary automobiles, the officers' family cars, with the officers inside wearing civilian clothes, looking like commuters. The line of cars followed behind 2 unmarked military vehicles. One was a supply van, and the other was a snow-white ambulance. It was an unmarked Level 4 biocontainment ambulance. Inside it, there were an Army medical evac team and a biocontainment pod known as a bubble stretcher. This was a combat medical stretcher enclosed by a biocontainment bubble made of clear plastic. If someone was bitten by a monkey, he would go into the bubble, and from there he would be transferred to the slammer. The supply van was a white, unmarked refrigerator truck. This was to hold dead monkeys and tubes of blood. There was not a uniform in the group, although a few members of the ambulance team wore camouflage fatigues. The caravan crossed the Potomac at Point of Rocks and hit Leesburg Pike just as rush hour began. The traffic became bumper to bumper, and the officers began to get frustrated. It took them 2 hours to reach the monkey house, contending the whole way with ill-tempered commuters. Finally, the column turned into the office park, which by that time was filling up with workers. The supply van and the ambulance were driven along the side of the monkey house, up onto a lawn, and were parked behind the building to get them out of sight. The back of the building presented a brick face, some narrow windows, and a glass door. The door was the insertion point. They parked the supply van up close to the door. At the edge of the lawn, behind the building, there was a line of underbrush and trees sloping down to hillside. Beyond that, there was a playground next to a daycare center. They could hear shouts of children in the air, and when they looked through the underbrush, they could see bundled up 4-year-olds swinging on swings and racing around a playhouse. The operation would be carried out near children. Jerry Jack studied a map of the building. He and Gene Johnson had decided to have all the team members put on their spacesuits inside the building rather than on the lawn, so that if any TV crews arrived, there would be nothing to film. The men went through the insertion door and found themselves in an empty storage room. It was the staging room. They could hear faint cries of monkeys beyond a cinder block wall. There was no sign of any human being in the monkey house. Jerry Jacks was going to be the first man in, the point man. He had decided to take with him one of his officers, Captain Mark Haynes, a former Green Beret. He was a short, intense man with a whipcord body who had been through the Green Berets scuba diving school. He had jumped out of airplanes at night into the open sea wearing scuba gear. "I'll tell you one thing," Haynes had once told me. "I don't do scuba diving for fun as a civilian. The majority of my diving has been in the Middle East." Captain Haynes was not a man who would get claustrophobia and go into a panic in a spacesuit. Furthermore, Captain Haynes was a veterinarian. He understood monkeys. Jackson Haynes climbed into the supply van and pulled a plastic sheet across the van's back door for privacy and stripped naked, shivering in the cold. They put on surgical scrub suits and then walked across the lawn, opened the glass door, and went into the storage room, the staging area, where an Army support team, the ambulance team, led by a captain named Elizabeth Hill, helped them into their spacesuits. Jerry knew nothing about biological field suits, and neither did Captain Haynes. The suits were orange Rakel suits, designed for field use with airborne biological agents, and they were the type of suits that had been used at Kidham Cave. In fact, some of them had come back from Africa in Gene Johnson's trunks. The suit had a clear, soft plastic bubble for a helmet. The suit is pressurized. Air pressure is supplied by an electric motor that sucks air from the outside and passes it through virus filters and then ejects it into the suit. This keeps the suit under positive pressure so that any airborne virus particles will have a hard time flowing into it. A Rakel suit performs the same job as a heavy-duty Kamchurian spacesuit. It protects the entire body from a hot agent, surrounding the body with superfiltered air. Army people don't generally refer to the Rakels as spacesuits. They call them Rakels, or field biological suits, but they are, in fact, biological spacesuits. Jackson Haynes put on rubber gloves, and the support team taped the gloves to the sleeves of the suits while they held their arms out straight. On their feet, they wore sneakers, and over the sneakers, they pulled bright yellow rubber boots. The support team taped the boots to the legs of the suits to make an airtight seal above the ankle. Jerry was terribly keyed up. In the past, he had lectured Nancy on the dangers of working with Ebola in a spacesuit, and now he was leading a team into an Ebola hell. At the moment, he didn't care what happened to himself, personally. He was expendable and he knew it. Perhaps he could forget about John for a while in there. He switched on his electric blower, and his suit puffed up around him. It didn't feel too bad, but it made him sweat profusely. The door was straight ahead. He held the map of the monkey house in his hand and nodded to Captain Haynes. Haynes was ready. Jerry opened the door, and they stepped inside. The sound of the monkeys became louder. They were standing in a windowless, lightless, cinder block corridor that had doors at either end. This was the makeshift airlock, the gray zone. The rule inside the airlock was that the two doors, the far door and the near door, could never be opened at the same time. This was to prevent a backflow of contaminated air coming into the staging room. The door closed behind them, and the corridor went dark. It went pitch dark. Jerry Jacks and Captain Mark Haynes felt their way down the dark corridor, toward the door that led into the hot zone. They opened it and found themselves standing at the junction of two corridors, bathed in a cacophony of monkey cries. The air handling equipment still wasn't working, and the temperature in the place seemed as if it was above 90 degrees. Jerry's head bubble fogged up. He pushed the bubble against his face to rub the moisture off the faceplate, and now he could see. The walls were gray cinder block, and the floor was painted concrete. Just then, he noticed a blur of motion on his left, and he turned and saw two Hazleton workers walking toward him. They weren't supposed to be in here. The area was supposed to be sealed off, but they had come in by another route that led through a storeroom. They wore respirators, but nothing covered their eyes. When they saw the two men in spacesuits, they froze, speechless. Jerry could not see their mouths, but when he saw their eyes, They were wide with astonishment. It was as if they had discovered they were standing on the moon. Jerry didn't know what to say. Finally, he said, "Which way to room H?" shouting to be heard over the blowers. The workers led him down the corridor to the infected room. It was at the far end of the hall. Then they retreated to the front of the building and found Dan Dalgard, who had been sitting in an office waiting for the army to come in. He showed up at room H moments later, wearing a respirator, to find out what was going on. Jerry looked at him as if he was insane. It was as if you went to a meeting with someone and the person showed up naked. Dalgard was not happy with the spacesuits. Apparently, he hadn't realized how the army would be outfitted. He gave them a tour of room H, feeling exceptionally nervous. "Looks like we have some sick monkeys in here," he said. Some of the monkeys went berserk when they saw the spacesuits. They spun in circles in their cages or cowered in the corners. Others stared at the humans with fixed expressions on their faces. "You see the clinical signs," Dalgard said, pointing to a monkey. "I feel pretty confident I can tell when a monkey is getting sick. They get a little bit depressed, they go off their food, and in a day or two, they're dead." Jerry wanted to look at all the monkeys in the monkey house. He and Captain Haynes went back out into the corridor and went from room to room through the entire building. They found other monkeys that seemed depressed, with the same glazed expression on their faces. Jackson Haynes, both of whom knew a lot about monkeys, didn't like the feel of this whole building. Something lived in here, other than monkeys and people.